In the next 1 hour, we will discuss the question of the war in Ukraine and its relations to the global affairs. And we'll have 45 minutes of moderated discussion led by me. My name is Anton Benderzsevsk. I'm director of Economus Economic Research Foundation here in Hungary, a think tank, a Hungarian think tank. So 45 minutes of moderated discussion, and then the last 50 minutes will be given to the audience, so you can ask your questions to the panel. I see many experts, many friends and colleagues here who could be also seated actually at this table. So I do believe the discussion will be interesting, and I do believe we will ask interesting questions. So let me introduce the panel, starting from the Paul de Quinoa, President at Palm Beach Freedom Institute, United States. And then Max Abrams, Professor at Northeastern University, United States. Then Jan Proud, Director of Diplomatic Excellence from United Kingdom. And Balázs Gyarabik, Analyst and Diplomat from Slovakia. So we have an interesting panel here: United States, United Kingdom, and Central Europe, Slovakia, Hungary, represented in the panel. So my question goes to all of you, and of course it's connected to the title and to the description of the panel. Has the war in Ukraine demonstrated the return to the traditional great power competition based on the spheres of influence? Will we see some kind of blocization of the different regions, global regions, what we've seen during the Cold War, or we are talking about some completely different structure in international relations? Maybe let's start from Balázs, and then maybe Paul will get back once we will get there.
Yes, thank you. And hi, everyone, and thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I just actually came back from Kiev. I was there on Monday night as well, which was really horrific. I felt it's exactly like even our hotel is under attack by all the drones. Things are really changing there very fast. But just to answer very quickly, a few thoughts on the blocks as well as the sphere of influence. When I'm a former diplomat, was seconded to the EU security mission until end of 2022, and I have been researching the EU Eastern Partnership forever, since actually its inception. So I know European colleagues don't really like to talk about it, but like what is the Eastern Partnership was all about from the very beginning. It was the EU sphere of influence. We just don't call it like that. It's a policy which was very effective in terms of soft power, and also trying to get an exclusive zone, like keep the Russians out as much as possible. There was a Russian reaction with the Eurasian Economic Union, obviously a different one, but very much designed based on the EU. So this kind of competition between the blocs. Russia is not a bloc, obviously, it's a federation officially, and the EU has been going on in the region in Eastern Europe for quite a lot of times. We do not talk about it in this way, but essentially that's how it is. Now with the Russian invasion, or as the Ukrainians like to call it, the full-scale war, simply because from Ukrainian viewpoint, this war has been ongoing with the Crimean annexation of Russia, as well as the conflict in Donbass. So the full-scale war has really broken this. It broken the Eastern Partnership policy, but also, as I used to describe, that the Russians' soft power has become really a failure, starting from the Eurasian Economic Union and other projects or efforts. And you can feel it, for example, in Kiev, how much the Russian influence and soft power is down. So they pull out the gun for various reasons. And, from my perspective, when you're pulling out the gun, you're not really winning. You're pulling out the gun because simply you think that there are no other arguments left. And that's what we've seen. It's really, I don't like the term full scale that much because I understand why they're using it, because any war is, in my reading, is full scale or quite full scale. But this was, it certainly is. And so that kind of changed the dynamic. It's ended, I think, the soft power influence. It's also very important, like, like not only the Eastern Partnership is there, but the EU integration as such. As a soft power, the EU has been, after the big enlargement in 2004, has been toying with this. They came up first with the the Eastern Partnership, but that's also a big guess whether the Eastern Partnership as well as the Association Agreement are instead of membership or toward membership. And just before the war, it was very clear that the Association Agreement meant to be the end of the process and not the beginning, meaning it's instead of membership. And the war has changed that dynamic as well. Now, officially, membership and EU integration is on the table. Unofficially, I can tell you that it's not really. So it is still, we want officially Moldova and Ukraine, but unofficially, we understand that this is also more a symbolic act to mobilize Ukrainians in the war, to make sure that there is a EU integration perspective or EU membership perspective for the Ukrainians who are fighting against the Russian invasion. So what I wanted to say, and I'm ending up here, this has been always the case. What the war brought is an abrupt end toward this. Now Europe is in the breaking point simply because what you see in the European Union is the isolation from Russia to the maximum extent. It used to be the Estonian strategy, and now it's fully a European strategy. A big question for Europe, I think, at this stage is whether this is going to be the case, or what the US policy shift to have a Russia policy as well as relationship, the diplomatic rehabilitation of Russia means for the European Union. If you look at the latest, the 18 sanction package, for example, in my reading, it's not only anti-Russian, it's also anti-US. Because they putting Nord Stream and a couple of other items into that, maximizing the isolation from Russia simply, as well as on Belarus, because that's also strengthening the sanctions on Belarus out of the blue, when the US is trying to also improve the relationship with the Belarusian regime. So I will stop here. And
yeah, thanks for inviting me today. I was a British diplomat for 24 years, including 4.5 years in Moscow from 2014 to 2019, from the onset of the Ukraine crisis through the Salisbury Nerve agent attack, through sanctions and everything else. But it's clear to me that actually the conflict in Ukraine started as a great power conflict between the US essentially and Russia, something that John Mearsheimer spoke about this morning. The EU partnership agreement was really Europe's attempt to kind of peel off former Soviet states from European influence by offering concessions that it had no intention really of delivering upon. That's why none of the partnership members have been able to join the EU or look likely to join the EU anytime soon, and that includes Ukraine, because actually the war in Ukraine just kicks down the road, the hot can of Ukrainian membership, which could have potentially quite devastating effects for the whole financial and political settlement of Europe itself. So on the question of blocs and geopolitical actors, I mean, I think actually the EU is a bloc, but I don't think it's a geopolitical actor, quite frankly. It's too kind of driven by nationalist sentiment in each of the countries that drives the lowest common denominator kind of policy making, including on Russia. That explains why Europe hasn't been able to mobilize sufficient support and resources to kind of provide Ukraine with the material that it needs to fight a war, while at the same time promising to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. So Europe is essentially kind of caught in these internal contradictions that it can't kind of break free of. And what I see happening now, as Trump moves away from the sort of Biden era of kind of confrontation with Russia, the Europeans are kind of circling the wagons, trying to kind of maintain that hard line towards Russia, while at the same time not confronting the fact that actually they no longer have the resources to continue the proxy war beyond this financial year, but kicking the can down the road because they know when the war ends, on terms that will be definitely unfavorable to Ukraine, the whole issue of accession will rear its ugly head, and that will raise a whole bigger set of much more complicated questions for Europe itself. So that's my opening pitch. Over to you.
Thank you. So the question, as I understand it, is about should we understand the war in Ukraine in terms of spheres of influence? And I think that more fundamentally, if you back up, this is really a question about to understand the war in Ukraine, how much does physical geography matter? So how much does physical geography matter in terms of explaining the war? I think it actually goes a long way. I mean, you cannot understand the conflict without understanding the geography in terms of Ukrainian fears of Russia and Russian fears of Ukraine and the history of conflict there. I also think that geography goes a long way in terms of explaining variation in concern about the war, where Europe, is closer to the conflict and cares more about it than, say, the United States. Even within Europe, I think that this explanation can help to predict variation in concern over the conflict, where countries which are located closer are disproportionately concerned, although they might not necessarily be concerned in the same way. If you were to compare, for example, Hungary's position to Poland's. I think that some of the some of the arguments for not being more involved can also be explained in terms of geography. Obama, for example, famously said that, well, let's not get too involved because Russia has escalation dominance. Why does Russia have escalation dominance? Because of their proximity to the conflict, which not only facilitates on a pragmatic level Russia's ability to ramp up involvement, but also dictates its threat perception. And in a related argument was actually made by politically minded people on the other side of the aisle, where they're not Obama supporters, but they may be MAGA supporters. And MAGA would say, well, shouldn't it be America first? Why are we so involved in this conflict? Look how far away it is. And so in this sense, physical, geography is absolutely essential, both towards explaining the argument for more involvement, as well as for explaining and justifying arguments for less involvement. That said, the counter argument might be that if you look at I don't want to be too academic here, but if you look at, the two main sort of academic paradigms in international relations, both of them, I think, reject a spheres of influence orientation. Liberalism in international relations cares a lot about ideology and basically thinks that the United States should be promoting democracy, and that holds true regardless of the geography. So Ukraine was of great importance because of the nature of its ideology compared to Russia. Some liberals, and I'm talking not liberals in the American domestic political setting, but in international relations theory, they go so far as to think that almost every country is on the table in terms of being of utmost concern to the United States precisely because of its ideology. So based on that paradigm, geography really doesn't actually matter that much. Although realists, they tend to be more sympathetic to spheres of influence arguments, and we see that in terms of their overlapping with MAGA. If you look at realist positions, say, in China, or with respect to that area of the world, you can see that they're not fully on board with the idea that there are spheres of influence. Everybody's talking, of course, about John Mearsheimer because of his importance and the fact that he just previously spoke. But of course, he's quite hawkish in terms of containing China. And a lot of folks in the Pentagon, like Elbridge Colby, for example, if you read his book, which I recommend, is all oriented towards containing China. So certainly the United States, whether you defer to liberals or realists, and Bridge considers himself a realist, are not on board with the idea of leading U.S. foreign policy in terms of a spheres of influence rubric. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Feel free to comment.
Just a quick comment on the escalation dominance point. I think the reason that Russia has escalation dominance is because it has a political will and the unilateral kind of space to act in the way that Europe doesn't, because it's held backed by its own limitations on collective decision making. But the geography, I mean, Europe is there, so it has the geography, but not the will.
Yeah, Paul, please.
So I'm actually a trained historian. I'm the president of the Palm Beach Freedom Institute, but I'm actually a recovering academic. I was a history professor for 15 years, and my field was Imperial Russia. So I tend to think of these things in broader sequences and over longer periods of time. And I find that useful for Ukraine because once you get past the symbolism, the intense emotion that's very much invested in this in the United States, but I think more so in Europe, you do see very important fractures and very important processes that are going on. The Russian perspective, if I can add that to this panel, is that Ukraine is part of their space. If you follow the Russian nationalists up to and including Vladimir Putin, this is exactly what they will tell you. They believe that they've come from a common origin in the Middle Ages and that Ukraine essentially is their part of the world, a place where they have had a massive presence for hundreds and hundreds of years. On the other hand, pose a question to the assembled people: when has it ever been in the, and this is very devil's advocate, the essential interest of the United States, when have we ever cared about who controlled Donetsk? Never. When have we cared about who controlled Kiev? Almost never. Even if the whole thing went down, it would still, in many minds, not be an American problem. To give you a sense of the scale of that, go back to the first President Bush speaking in Kiev in the early 1990s on the eve of the Soviet collapse, admonishing the Ukrainian separatists that independence was probably not a very good idea. Not very realistic, it could be destabilizing. It was a position widely shared in the American foreign policy establishment at that time, including by people like Henry Kissinger. And this, of course, added to President Bush's public image, pre-Gulf War image anyway, as a wimp. Remember that William Safire, the conservative New York Times columnist, called it the Chicken Kiev speech, because he hadn't really established a firm position. Like, this was our chance to break up the Soviet Union, and here you have the President of the United States saying, no, this isn't right, we shouldn't do this. Follow forward a few years later to the Budapest Agreement, the agreement signed in this city, in which the United States, Russia, and the UK made these agreements about the sanctity of borders in post-Soviet space. If you look at the really fine print, there is absolutely no U.S. assurance of assistance to Ukraine if it would be attacked. We promised them humanitarian aid if they denuclearized. It was thought that if we had a security guarantee, unilateral, multilateral, or bilateral, that it would be too provocative to Russia. Who signed the agreement for the United States in 1994 was Donald Blinken, former ambassador to Hungary and father of Biden's Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Right? These patterns should never be ignored. So as you go forward, you will see this jockeying of position in America that's not so interested in post-Soviet space, at least within the NIS part of it, the newly independent states regions, that, but at the same time very eager to move into Central and Eastern Europe, and a Russia that would like to resurge. And within the Russian leadership, this is going back again 300 or 400 years, there are always two factions, one that's more open to dialogue with the West, even toward integration with the West, and another that looks into Russia as either an Asian power fundamentally or as something of its very own. We use this term Eurasianism, which is actually have a renewed popularity now with Mr. Dugin and the ideologists who are closer to Putin. In the 1990s, that pro-Western faction was ascendant, and with Putin's evolution very quickly after becoming president, we've seen them lose ground to the ultra-nationalists and to the Eurasianists, who would argue that any Western presence in former Soviet space is inherently a threat. Their problem, of course, is how to deal with this. And for all the talk we've had at the conference about a multipolar world, like how many B-2 bombers does Russia have in Diego Garcia right now? None. Why are we all speaking in English in Budapest at this international conference? Because we don't live in a multipolar world. We still live in a unipolar world. And you can think otherwise if it comforts you. But that's about all it's going to do in practical politics. Now, what that means for the Russians is that they have to function essentially as what Barack Obama called them, a regional power, to try to be a spoiler in international affairs. And if you want to understand what's happening in Ukraine, I would look at the longer duration of Russian policy toward the former Soviet states, particularly in Central Asia, where they tried and eventually succeeded in forcing the US to give up the base in Manas in Kyrgyzstan. I'd look at Georgia, where they fought a spoiler conflict when it seemed like Georgia might be heading toward NATO membership in the early thousands. I'd look at Moldova, where they maintain a military presence, and then finally at Ukraine, where they've been active since 2014. In every case, what the Russians have pursued is a frozen conflict. Why would you want a frozen conflict? What's the advantage to Russia? We're talking about, at an official level anyway, EU membership or prospective NATO membership for these countries. But if you look at the terms, what do you have to do to be a NATO country or an EU country? You have to have undisputed borders and unchallenged territorial integrity, right? At least de facto, this is what you absolutely have to have. It was imposed even on Hungary. When Hungary joined the EU and NATO, they had to recognize the border, recognize that Transylvania is Romania now, and this is the way it would be. It was done to Germany when it unified in 1990 as a NATO power. This is the formal acceptance of the post-World War II borders, without which they couldn't hope for membership in NATO as a united country. And it's been done progressively. Now, if you want to stop a country from becoming either EU or NATO, what must you then do? Make sure its borders are disputed. Georgia's borders are disputed. Abkhazia and Northern Ossetia are Russian territory. They're handing out Russian passports to the local population and telling them that they're Russians and challenging anybody who would dispute that status quo. The international community may not like it or recognize it, but so what? The point is to dispute the border, not to please people. Same thing in Moldova. Russian troop presence, this Transnistria issue that doesn't go away, effectively prevents Moldova from ever acceding either to the European Union or to NATO. Think about Ukraine taking over the sort of Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, Crimea, historical areas that they feel entitled to, blocks Ukrainian adhesion to the West. And remember that the entire dispute, going back to the color revolutions in 2005, was fundamentally about how close Ukraine could drift to Europe and to the European Union. Disrupting the economic arrangements that were coming into place was an essential part of Russian strategy in maintaining Yanukovych in power until 2014, and then also trying to disrupt any kind of pro-Ukrainian relationship. Now, I think in some ways that strategy obviously is backfired. Again, this idea of a multipolar world falls pretty flat when you ask the question of if Russia's an equal pole in the world politics, how come it can't defeat its own former satellite state after 3 years of 1,000 days, in the title of our panel, of brutal warfare? If you're so great, why can't you achieve this fantastic military goal? And also, I think it alienates Ukraine permanently, because if you take over the Russian-speaking sections, you make them Russian citizens, and in the event of a peace deal, they'll never again vote in Ukrainian elections, so there'll never be a democratically chosen Russian party within that country ever again. Right? And you've set up this antagonism with the West. Now it seems like Putin's open to this ongoing negotiation, and my prediction, which was my prediction in February 2022, it's the same, and it's also was the late Henry Kissinger's prediction, we'll probably get a peace settlement that nobody really likes, but that resembles the frozen conflicts we've already seen. And this will continue a historic pattern.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, 40 years ago, probably at such international conference, we would speak Russian in Hungary, unfortunately. So I'm really happy that we do speak English now here in Hungary.
If we had this conference in Moscow, we would probably also be speaking in English.
Kai Kallas wants us all to learn Russian. Kai Kallas wants us all to learn Russian today, so we're back in the room.
Okay, let me start another round of questions, but it will be a targeted round, focusing on Europe this time. So my question to Balázs, especially since you're just back from Kiev, and you're from Slovakia and Hungary. So from Central and Eastern European perspective, how would sustainable peace look like?
Yes, it's an excellent question because there's no answer for it. Simply, there's no Central European perspective on it. The Polish perspective is very different from the Hungarian perspective. The Slovak perspective is different from both. And the Czech Republic is obviously not even mention them, or Austria, if we count Austria as Central Europe, which I do. Moreover, there is not even a Central European mechanism when these countries would be discussed as. Some of the countries are a very big part of the coalition of the willings, and all of these countries are being influenced by the influx of Ukrainian refugees, as well as Western media coverage, how we're seeing the war in Ukraine as well. But one thing I can say is that also Central Europe is under a very heavy influence. This is the first region which is heavily paying the price, mostly the economic price. This is the region where it's mostly dependent on the Russian energy still. The EU as such is there is no dependency on Russian energy, but here is some of the countries, particularly Hungary and Slovakia is. So there's a lot of factor which is influencing history, obviously Poland, which is influencing the region's relationship with Ukraine. And based on my conversation, I think it's already, even the presidential administration in Ukraine realized that Central Europe relationship are really down. They're feeling that, for example, they're losing Poland after the Polish presidential elections. And they try to improve relationship now with Slovakia and have a very bad relationship with Hungary. Obviously, and they're also preparing that after the Czech elections, the Czech government will be also very different or can be different toward that. But so what kind of, I think most of the Central Europeans would like to see peace simply because they're also connecting ending the war with the inflation and they connecting the inflation with the war, obviously. So when I'm talking to my Ukrainian friends and trying to explain that Slovakia, the Slovak public is not necessarily pro-Russian when they're supporting peace. They actually pro-peace. And it is the Ukrainian context which is defining pro-peace as pro-Russian. It's really not the Slovak context. So, Central Europe feels the war first and foremost simply because we are the closest. And therefore, the Central European and the ordinary people are really want the peace simply because the war is the closest. It is that simple. So I think the elites are realizing that there is no possibility of having a full-fledged peace. And I think, a frozen conflict would be a realistic outcome, which we would like to see, or the Central Europeans would agree. I think that also even includes Poland now, simply because the Poles are looking at the war. Well, first of all, they really supporting Ukraine war effort, but at the same time, actually not any longer. But at the same time, they're also having an issue, the integration issue of the Ukrainian refugees, which is providing a tremendous economic benefit for the Polish economy. But at the same time, Poland, just like Hungary, is monoethnical, meaning the influx of such a high level of Ukrainian refugees having an impact, a national security impact as well, how to integrate those Ukrainian refugees, workers, and so on into the Polish society. And there is a certain level where this is not necessarily that much possible. In Slovakia, we're already having an issue in Eastern Slovakia simply because these are heavily Russian and Ukrainian speakers. I'm sometimes joking, half serious, half joke, that we lost Prešov and Košice to Ukraine. Already not entirely true, but also one of the main factor of the war is how Ukraine is shifting toward the West. Not many people talking about it simply because under the pressure of the Russian war, the entire regions are also moving toward the West, and that means cross-border as well. So we do see serious regional implications vis-a-vis Central Europe and Ukraine, which is not going to go away And that needs to be also taken into Central European as well as EU policy making as such.
Thank you. My question to Jan, I see you want to react, but yeah, you can do that. But let me ask you a question, and then you can combine them. So, from UK perspective, how has the United Kingdom's view on European security has changed or evolved since the Brexit? And how does the UK see itself? Is it a bridge between the US and Europe, or it's a buffer?
I'm not entirely sure that the UK really has a clear sense of its role in European security going forward, given its kind of fairly limited commitment to increase defence spending. But I mean, Keir Starmer is trying to position Britain as a bridge between Europe and the US under President Trump. That hasn't really succeeded, because that kind of circling of the wagons that I mentioned earlier, has solidified itself. Starmer's not been able to kind of find any common ground between the Europeans, which are becoming, if anything, more hardline on continuing the war at the time when Trump is trying to sort of deliver some sort of a peace. The UK, in terms of its defence capabilities, just isn't big enough really to affect significantly European security unless it works in partnership and collaboration with its European partners. Our army is tiny, our defence spending is smaller than Germany's. We're not looking to increase it by a significant amount on the back of the Strategic Defence Review recently kind of published. I think there's a gradual kind of understanding that we need to kind of be almost like a convening force with our 2 aircraft carriers and this kind of carrier strike group deployment to the Indo-Pacific that's happening right now, probably supporting America's war in Iran as well, I should imagine. But there's been no sort of big grand plan for European security as far as I can see in the UK. Starmer has failed to act as a bridge between the US and Europe, and for now appears to be focused on kind of continuing the war with no obvious kind of goal in sight would be my answer to that. Briefly, to come back on Paul's thing, which I really, really enjoyed actually, Paul, your talk. It's fascinating, particularly on the Blinken point. There's one point of disagreement I had there, though, on the issue of partition, because if you look at the examples of Cyprus and also West Germany, which you in fact mentioned, they were able to integrate with Europe while being partitioned. And I just happen to know somebody in the room who visited Turkish Cyprus quite recently, but that's another story altogether.
Thank you, Jan. I have a combined question to Max and Paul. So it would be interesting to see your point of view on Europe from United States. How do you see the so-called strategic autonomy, which was announced by European leaders? What does it mean in 2025? And is it possible for Europe to develop such autonomous security policy, or it will be always dependent on United States in terms of military and security?
I'm going to do something panelists seldom do. I'm going to cede my time to Paul just because I'm happy to be here, but my bread and butter expertise is really terrorism, counterterrorism, IR security, Middle East stuff. Maybe there'll be some Q&A related to that. There does seem to be a strong undercurrent in views, probably because this is based in Hungary, for a realist understanding of the conflict in Ukraine. And quite frankly, I'm very sympathetic to it. So I haven't really heard anything at this conference that I disagree with. I thought that the last panel, with the realist application to Ukraine very well captured my understanding as well. However, I do not consider myself a realist, actually. And I think that realism is good for the Ukraine war, as well as understanding many of the dynamics between the US and Europe. But realism is actually quite terrible for understanding other areas of international security. And I'm happy to critique that later, but I don't want to derail us and get too off topic.
Well, thank you, Max, for this extra time. I think we've seen some very dynamic developments in that area in the last few months, particularly. I believe Europe has the potential, certainly the population, resources, military technology, to create its own security system. I don't believe it has the political will, or despite the fact that it's called the European Union, the political unity to do so. And the case I would cite would follow from President Zelensky's disastrous Oval Office meeting in February, where he violated what I call diplomacy 101. If a major country has just given you at least $100 billion in military aid and you want more, don't go to its president's office and start an argument with him on television. Even if you think you're right, even if you think he's completely wrong. Just in the practice of diplomacy, and maybe Ian and our other diplomats here might disagree with me, but it just seems like a really bad idea in pretty much anything, especially diplomacy. After that, we had this sort of scramble among the European powers saying, well, Trump's a disrespectful SOB, and here we are to save the Ukrainians. They had that meeting in London where they had talked about it for, I think, a day or two and came up with exactly nothing. And since then, in the weeks that followed, it's completely fizzled. The idea that there would be a European security guarantee to Ukraine now seems to be on the verge of ridiculous and completely unrealistic. And the sort of modus operandi that they've come up with is what the American Treasury Secretary Steve Bessent calls an economic security guarantee. The Americans get mineral rights, broadly speaking, in Ukraine. And as a result, that gives the Americans a stake in defending Ukraine's independence, but it will be the Europeans that are the first line of defense. There have been some attempts, I think, in the political science realm to compare these sort of parallel conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and between Israel and its adversaries in the Middle East. I think the one point where you can compare them well, in a lot of cases they're apples and oranges, but a place where you can compare it well is in this idea of a security guarantee. And I think unless the bombing has started during the panel, which it may very well have, what we're probably seeing in the Middle East could be, I don't know. They're weighing the options carefully. But what you see is essentially an American outsourcing of its security protocols to Israel in denuclearizing Iran through force without direct involvement. Now, how big that mountain is and whether the Iranians are willing to surrender unconditionally are the great unknowns, but it may or may not involve American military power.
I didn't know this was allowed, the Middle East talk. I would have gotten in more.
Well, Max, you can have some of your time back if you'd like. I should add, much of my academic career was spent in the Middle East, so I was 14 years between Cairo and Beirut watching this live back when it was still fun.
Max, would you like to comment on that? Maybe.
Sure. I mean, I'll give a few quick critiques because I've thought a lot about this with respect to how poorly realists have fared in terms of understanding what's going on in the Middle East. Realism has, again, been really good for understanding the war in Ukraine. But what I've found is that realists sort of almost by definition, they don't regard non-state actors as meaningful variables in the international system. And if that's your viewpoint, then you simply are not going to understand the international relations of the Middle East. You're not going to understand U.S. Mideast policy. In addition, realists seem to have a bias in thinking not only that non-state actors are essentially trivial, but that counterterrorism operations against them are basically folly. Realists pretty much systematically oppose kinetic operations against terrorists. This was true even during the heyday of Islamic State, when Islamic State was threatening to take Baghdad, Damascus. There were mass casualty terrorist attacks inside the United States. If you look at the leading realists at that time, people like John Mearsheimer, I dare say, and even Stephen Walt, they were opposed not just to U.S. ground forces, but even U.S. participation in the air campaign. And as we saw, the U.S., with some other very important actors, some of them adversaries, was actually quite useful in degrading the caliphate. Fast forward to more recently, and the realists opposed Israeli counterterrorism measures, especially kinetic ones against Hamas, strangely on the basis of humanitarian grounds, even though that's inconsistent seemingly with realism. But they also said that Israel wouldn't have any effectiveness in terms of degrading Hamas. They also opposed Israeli operations against Hezbollah. John Mearsheimer went on Glenn Greenwald and said, and many other shows, and said that Israel bizarrely was getting wrecked in Lebanon and doing no real damage to Hezbollah. It is not only are those assertions completely incorrect, but in making incorrect assertions, you can't begin to understand other critical aspects about the international relations of the Middle East. For example, without understanding the degradation of Hezbollah, you cannot understand the fall of Assad. The so-called rebels, or whatever you want to call them, they acknowledge that they took Aleppo and then headed to Damascus precisely because Hezbollah had been so degraded, contrary to John Mearsheimer's predictions. The fall of Assad may very well not have happened without all of this success against the so-called Ring of Fire. In the Israeli war, I know this, that Netanyahu really began planning in earnest attacking Iran only after neutralizing the so-called Ring of Fire without understanding the Hamas attack and then Hezbollah's declaration of war against Israel, Israel's success against both Hamas and then Hezbollah. You cannot understand the timing at all of Israeli operations now against Iran. So I do think this is a useful theory, this paradigm that seems to be applied both explicitly and implicitly to one of the main focuses of the conference with Ukraine, but in my bread and butter area, it fares abysmally.
Thank you, Max. Balázs indicated that he wants to comment something.
Yeah, just I want to kind of divert back from the Middle East back to Ukraine, and since I'm the only EU national and former EU official, I would be happy to kind of try to describe very quickly what the EU is really aiming at this. Indeed, the coalition of the willing was a reaction on the Oval Office. I fully agree. It wasn't really so, as well as the main aim of it is try to lure the Trump administration back to where it used to be, supporting Ukraine, essentially returning to the Biden-era policy. And so what we're seeing ever since is exactly that. It's not the on paper incredible amount of defense budget, which so far is on paper, but they're working on it. And all this is a reaction on Trump. Remember, before the US elections, it was the so-called Trump proofing of NATO. Those were the times as well as the term. And now it's the coalition of the willing, where essentially it's really about the US focus. Europe, and this is Kiev view as well, arguably cannot replace the US in terms of military assistance. And one of the big questions in Kiev right now among the international financial institutions, how they're going to finance the US grants as a direct budget support for the Ukrainians. So essentially, that coalition...
I believe President Trump said the other day he wants interest payments in addition to the mineral rights on our foreign aid to Ukraine.
Right, exactly. So what I'm meaning is that Europe, why we increase the posture as well as the rhetoric, we're not able to do much of the policies which we would like to see without the US. So this is mostly about the US at this stage. The one emerging theme is, though, which is called the Danish model, which I think is important, is that finally this money would be increased as an investment into Ukrainian military production. I think it's also a very important thing, but it's a long game. It's certainly not going to help the Ukrainians anytime soon. But this is also something which is another emerging kind of understanding that the only security guarantee for Ukraine is going to be its own army and not much else. So therefore, and this is one of the big topics between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations, the so-called demilitarization, which is a key issue for any peace talks later on.
The Ukrainians could always, the Danish could always, in their model, sell us Greenland and get the revenue that way.
It's always great to have Americans telling us what to do.
Thank you. Well, we still have 40 minutes, so I would like to open the floor for questions. Please let it be a question, not a statement. And please introduce yourself. I will collect 3 questions. And then we have Evgeny, we have Peter, and gentleman further. Yes, so let's start with Evgeny.
Thank you very much, Anton. Evgeny Preherman, Minzdala Council on International Relations in Belarus. So if we work on this premise, which we heard today during this panel, but also in the morning, that the best we can get out of this terrible war is frozen conflict. Obviously, that will not allow a proper discussion about a new fully fledged security architecture in Europe. But what will still, in your opinions, and I'm interested in everyone's opinion, be possible as a matter of discussion in terms of the future of European security when we have this frozen conflict, but when we still need to discuss ways of minimizing, reducing military risks and tensions, basically dealing with the security dilemma, more or less, on the border between Belarus and Poland, let's say. So what do you think is still feasible and meaningful to be discussed in this context for the future of European security while we don't have a solution for Russia-Ukraine war?
Thank you. Yeah, next question from Peter. Please remember the questions and then we'll go back to them.
I'm Peter Siklosi from the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. And my question is, would a frozen conflict in Ukraine be so bad? After all, both the Second World War between Russia and Japan and the Korean War ended with only a ceasefire, which we can say is a frozen conflict. And both of these countries, I mean Japan and South Korea, eventually became very successful countries. Couldn't that model work in the Ukrainian case as well?
Thank you. And now we had the gentleman there. Yes, please.
George Beebe with the Quincy Institute. I have a question about spheres of influence. You began by asking, is the war in Ukraine a return to this concept of sphere of influence? And it seems to me that the kind of sphere of influence that we're talking about matters. You could argue that during the Cold War, Finland was in the Soviet sphere of influence, but it had a much different relationship with the Soviet Union than members of the Warsaw Pact tended to have. And I think one of the questions we have to ask here is, if Russia is looking for a sphere of influence in Ukraine, is it a sphere of influence that allows a significant degree of political and economic self-determination in Ukraine, even if there are real limits imposed on the Ukrainian military and its security relationships? So I'd wonder if you could comment on that.
Thank you. Gentlemen, we have 3 questions. So if you want to start, you can react only on some of them, all of them, whatever you want.
So I think my response actually goes to all 3 questions. We spent a lot of time talking about the security aspect, and clearly that's very important. There will be a frozen conflict when this war eventually ends. But looking to the future, the best way to kind of secure Ukraine's future, Ukraine's security, is by some reckoning with the economic aspects of peace. And for me, I've boiled it down to kind of 3 R's. First is reconstruction and reform of Ukraine as part of its accession process. There will have to be massive investment. There will have to be kind of turbocharged reform, which has been on the back burner, frankly, since 2014, all efforts to actually reform, tackle corruption, deal judicial issues, and all those kind of things in Ukraine. That should be a massive priority for European sort of engagement with Ukraine. But also kind of reckoning with Europe's economic relationship with Russia. I think the best way to secure peace in Ukraine long term is to have an economic arrangement in which actually kind of Russia doesn't feel continued in a state of continued isolation economically from Europe, given the sort of low energy that it has to offer and that sort of thing. So that Europe has to kind of reach some reckoning with Ukraine and with Russia, so that there's a gradual normalization of economic relationships across Ukraine, Russia, and and the Europe itself, and that means a reckoning with Europe's relationship with the US, of course. And longer term, it's a reorientation within the multipolar world, recognizing that actually Europe's prosperity, Europe's security long term rests more in terms of its relations to the East more than to the West and across the Atlantic. And finally, sort of tackling this fixation we have on NATO as the underpinning, and I actually fundamentally disagree that NATO has been the underpinning of European peace and security since the end of World War II, but setting that matter aside, moving much more towards the economic and the things that actually made Europe successful, in the first place.
It's interesting how frozen conflict has almost like a negative connotation in the middle of a hot conflict. It seems to me that actually a frozen conflict at this point should be the goal.
Well, it's a matter of perspective. If the frozen conflict front line goes through your village in Ukraine, it's probably a pretty shitty deal. But for everybody else, yeah, I think that's ideal. Does this block a European security system? I doubt it. Like Peter said, separating the two Koreas along an armistice line that was settled in 1953 has not in any way prevented architectures of East Asian security. I think it's perfectly possible to work around it. It might be frustrating for some of the local actors, but in terms of a larger system, I think that would be, if not ideal, then something we would probably have to live with. Again, what we predicted before, when Russia came back in February of 22, would be a peace deal that nobody really likes and probably doesn't work perfectly, but it's what we'll have. It's like being stuck in a bad marriage. Do you stay for the kids or do you throw the whole thing out or what? So this is what we're looking at. And then, of course, to go to Peter's question, would it be so bad? No, I don't think so. For George, what does Russia want out of Ukraine? They actually are quite specific. They do want Ukraine's constitution to reflect a prohibition on Ukraine ever joining NATO, whether there's a frozen conflict there or not. This is, again, a Russian consideration, and their belief is that NATO is an evil plot that's meant to destroy their country, right? And you can have this argument with Russians and tell them that, no, actually it's a defensive alliance, and it doesn't actually work unless you attack one of its members, thus bringing war with all of its other members, but they really just don't see it that way. They believe this is a evil Western conspiracy led by nasty Americans who want to enslave them. But then this has psychological and historic dimensions that are beyond the point of the panel, but it's a perspective that we simply can't ignore if we want to maintain that frozen conflict.
Yes, I agree that the frozen conflict at this stage it's not bad or good. It's just simply the only result we can have. It's the only way to end the war, simply. My understanding, and yes, when it comes to the sphere of influence, so far Ukraine is in our sphere of influence. And I think, yes, Russia wants to revert it, but at the same time, the war's influence is going to be poisoning the relationship between Russia and Ukraine, I think, for generations. Putin at some point said that time will solve it. I suspect there is going to be a lot of time until it solves it. And really even the Russian, I mean, if you look at the map, it's the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine which suffers the most, and those regions are suffering the most. And the shock there have been the biggest from the war itself. So that's being said, Ukraine, and so I think there are two fundamental questions now for the European Union. We are not really understanding what kind of Ukraine is emerging from this war. There's very little knowledge and understanding about that. And so the closer the war is going to be toward ending, the highest this question, the most important this question is going to emerge. The second is what we're going to do with Russia. So far, especially when it comes to the US-Russia recalibration. And a bit of a test here is Belarus, Zhenya. I think it's kind of what we see now is going to be determining as well, or can determine as well as influence what we're going to do overall with Russia. So far, what we see or what you can hear is that the Europeans are preparing for war with Russia. You know, we're going to have a war with Russia, saying European security officials, ministers of defense, NATO officials sometimes as well joining. And this is in contrast with, you know, obviously what the US is doing. But at the same time, both the US and the Europeans are interested in the security, the defense, improving the defense posture as well as capacity, where Ukraine can play a very important role. So I think Ukraine going to stay, at least the kind of Ukraine is going to emerge from this phase of the war is going to stay in the sphere of influence of Europe, particularly in the security domain, unless something dramatic changes.
Thank you. We have time for one quick question and quick reactions. We have two questions. Maybe lady first. I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for an excellent panel. You have so much expertise on the EU perceptions, and I'm wondering if you can put some light on the accession agreement, because I never heard it described quite that way, the way you framed it as you're not going to get in, and this is, but Stefan Füle, for example, internally I was told through interviews, the European External Action Service warned that this could have a very negative repercussion if they continue to have this agreement signed by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian president told them, I cannot sign this agreement. And then maybe they could have given them a diplomatic off-ramp. But instead, Catherine Ashton, the EU High Representative at that time, and Stefan Füle said, the train has left the station. You better sign this or forget about it. So the EU never likes to talk about that. But I'm wondering how you perceive this agreement, especially if it was just kind of something to get rid of Ukraine from becoming an EU member state. It just seems like a catastrophic event. And just one other point, Cyprus is blocks so many things. So the idea of having a country that was divided into the EU has been a huge problem for EU directives. And then Slovenia was also kind of pressured to ignore the border dispute with Croatia. So that has also continued to blow up. So I think that it's really important when you have leverage before they become an EU member state to straighten these things out before they become a member. That's just a second point.
Thank you. So that last question about Ukraine's EU accession, especially for Balázs, but then anybody else, feel free to.
One last thing, though, this over-promising and under-delivering. I mean, the Ukrainians were like, we want to send people to the parliament to just sit as observers. I mean, I think that they're actually setting them up for almost huge disappointment. And what's going to be the backlash on that?
Thank you. So Balázs starts, and then anybody else can comment in 2 minutes, please.
So that's my own framing. I wrote about it already 10 years ago, at least like instead or toward. You know, an accession, and you know, this has been always a struggle. I mean, historically, the Orange Revolution in 2004 happened exactly the same year when the Big Bang EU enlargement. So the Eastern Partnership have been, remember, it's a Polish-Sweden initiative announced in Czech Republic in 2009. Was always, you know, preparing something for Ukraine as a reward for exactly choosing a European path, what we were calling the Orange Revolution, overall back in 21 years ago. Now, it's not a setup. It is the EU policymaking shenanigans, which exactly as you say is overpromising. If you open von der Leyen tweets, it's all about one hyperbole after another hyperbole after another one, right? And yes, I mean, the decision making is such that it's obviously a guaranteed underperformance as well. Now, when it comes to the EU, the Commission is very serious about the EU membership process. At the same time, they're fully aware that the member states are not. If you go to Berlin, if you go to Paris, by talking points, you're going to get that we are serious, but at the same time, we understand that it's going to be very difficult to get it. This being said, if you look at Ukraine is already beyond EU integration mechanisms. The level of support is around 100 billion a year. Now the EU should be taking care of it fully. Now the biggest EU net recipient, Poland, is getting around about 11 billion euro a year from the EU, from the cohesion and the regional funds. So Ukraine needs, as well as the current support, is way beyond what an EU integration membership can provide. The problem with the EU policymaking is that every single step is temporary, just like the trade regime, which was ended in June 6, and they just announced that the temporary protection mechanism is going to be also phasing out in 2027. These are all temporary steps designed to be temporary, and the EU could not come up with regular mechanisms, neither for the money, nor for the refugees, or for the trade relationship, and so on and so on. So that is, unfortunately, it's their homework. Now, this being said, you're already seeing the resentment from Ukraine. There was a survey of the EU security mission 3 months ago when there was a question, so the EU integration, the EU integration would be 68% of the Ukrainians said that their interest is more important than the EU integration. So meaning putting Ukraine first is more important than the EU integration. Ukrainians now, after this war, are not necessarily seeing themselves in the EU. That is something which is, the EU is still remaining very attractive, but it's no longer credible for Ukraine.
Can I jump in? Yeah, Poland would become a net contributor to the EU budget if it joined. That's why Polish farmers were up in arms about sort of flood of Ukrainian imports at the start of the war. That's why Władysław Sikorski is happy for the war to continue and is in no hurry for Ukraine to join the European Union. I mean, these are the sad facts. This is why Emmanuel Macron at the start of the war said it would take at least 10 to 15 years for Ukraine to join the EU, because French farmers will be up in protest about Ukraine joining with 1/4 of Europe's total agricultural land and taking away all of the French agricultural subsidies. So these are the sad realities. On your point about decision making, the European, as I said at the start, the reason the European Union isn't a geopolitical actor is that its decision making processes don't allow it to take decisive steps in the kind of security and intelligence field. It just cannot do that. It always ends up in a lowest common denominator position. That's a far easier tension to manage when you're only focusing on the economic and social and cultural aspects, which has been the kind of bread and butter of the European project up until the Ukraine war started. So it can never get past that from a security and intelligence perspective. That's why it can't really impose itself on the war in Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, when Ukraine joins, if Ukraine joins, it will almost certainly join the European Union as a second-class citizen, with lower access to kind of benefits and subsidies at other EU member states, which may erode ultimately Ukraine's desire to join.
Thank you very much. You want some last remark?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I think it's already quite hopeless, and I think for that, just look at what they do with Zelensky now. Every time they have a meeting, they bring him in like he's furniture or something. Like furniture, he's there like a piece of furniture. He contributes nothing of substance. He's there so the European leaders can virtue signal and say that they care about Ukraine, which they largely don't or can't do anything about. And it pretty much ends there. And again, as we were saying before, their chances of entering the EU or NATO are non-existent as long as that large Russian military presence remains in the country. And even if we could make an exception, Ian mentioned before the cases of West Germany and Cyprus, but these were recognized as integral governments without occupying armies in their regions when they joined the institutions. Even if we made an exception for that, is there a European will to accept membership of a country that's actively at war with a much larger country to the east that's nuclear? Probably not. So they're doomed. Without a frozen conflict and a workable security guarantee.
No, unfortunately, we are 5 minutes behind the schedule. I'm so sorry. I have to close the panel now. Thank you very much, first of all, for the organization, for Hungarian Institute of International Affairs and for Observer Research Foundation to make this discussion possible. And of course, please give a big applause for our speakers here.